arms work just as hard as our legs. Fire up your triceps.
Your hips are dipping, always the option to come down to the knee.
Not as a weakness, but as a sense of strength, something that's empowering.
Namaste.
Hi yogis, this video today is going to be about how to get into crow pose. Crow pose is what I like to call the gateway arm balance or inversion. It's kind of my favorite pose to get people off of their feet and onto their hands. And I feel like once you get comfortable with crow pose, the other arm balances and inversions get a little less scary. You're also training your core muscles that you'll use for things like handstand or other crow variations like side crow. You start to get your center of gravity a little bit more in tune with being on your hands. And it's just a fun little party trick too. So for those of us who are new to crow pose, I'm going to walk us through general what crow is and then some modifications on how to get you flying into your crow. So for crow, we're going to start with hands spread nice and wide. So the wider that your fingers are, the more space you're going to have to balance on your hands. So make sure you spread your fingers out. Then you're going to place your hands about shoulder width distance apart on your mat. So your wrists should be right under your shoulders. Then from here, we're going to bend our elbows back in towards our body. So think about creating a little shelf with your arms. We're not going out to the side like a push-up. We're going in towards our body like a chaturanga. From here, you're going to take your feet a little bit closer to your hands and then start to shift your butt kind of up over your shoulders. So you're already bringing your center of gravity more over your wrists. From here, you're going to take your knees or your shins onto your triceps. Think about trying to stick your knees in your armpits. This is a real common question I get, like where exactly are my knees supposed to be? It's going to be a little bit different for everybody and a little bit different depending on your hip mobility, your core strength, how comfortable you are being on your hands. So just don't worry so much if you're new to crow, like where exactly your hips need to be or where exactly your knees need to be. Just kind of get a feel for it, see where you're happy, and it'll change as your crow improves. So gazing forward, you want to gaze about 12 inches or so in front of your fingertips. 8 to 10 inches is fine too. You just don't want to look back. If you look back, you will end up doing a somersault. It's super tempting, those of us who are new to crow, to look at your feet to see if your toes are going to lift off the floor. I watch people do it all the time. But what happens is when your head dips, your center of gravity starts to roll you forward once you lift your toes. So if your toes are lifting, you're just going to have a brief moment of looking at them before you end up flipping forward into a somersault. So you want to be looking ahead to keep your weight distributed properly and so that you have a focus of where you're wanting to go, which is forward. So once you're looking ahead, start to shift some weight into your hands. Maybe play with lifting one set of toes, getting to see how that feels. Maybe play with lifting the other. I've had people tell me that lifting one set of toes at a time is actually harder for them than lifting both sets. So if you feel like it's really challenging just to lift one foot, maybe you just dive in the deep end, go for it, and try to lift your both sets of toes at the same time. So this is crow. From here, you can play with getting your arms a little bit straighter once you get more comfortable, but start with a generous bend in the elbows until you get used to balancing on your hands. Now, if it's a little bit scary to be on our hands, which is kind of a weird thing for most of us, we can start with a block either under our feet. So this is going to be modification number 1. You can stand on your block. Same thing, hands spread nice and wide, elbows bend in towards you, knees or shins on the triceps, and then you don't ever have to leave your block. You can just play with leaning forward into your hands, looking ahead, feeling the weight in your palms, and then you have that sensation of being lifted up, but without ever leaving the ground. So you're feeling that sense of having your hips slightly elevated, playing with bringing your weight forward, but you're not actually ever leaving the ground if you're afraid of being off your feet. Then once you get more comfortable with that balancing aspect, maybe taking the block away and playing with lifting the toes. Another thing that you can use your block for, this is not my personal favorite, but it's helped some of my students, so I'm gonna show it to you, is placing a block under your forehead. If you are really afraid of falling, number one, you don't have that far to fall, so you're probably not gonna really hurt yourself. Number 2, I encourage you to practice falling. Maybe just do a somersault, get it out of your system. You know, worst case scenario, you might end up in a somersault. If you do a somersault and realize, hey, it's not that big of a deal, then the worst case scenario is no longer that bad. But if you just need that little extra support of bringing the ground a little bit closer to you, you can do your normal crow, hands spread wide, knees come up, looking ahead, and then maybe kind of resting your forehead on the block and balancing on your hands. So a little bit less scary. Now the reason that I don't particularly like this modification is if you do fall, you have a block under your head. So you're gonna fall on a block, and you could kind of maybe possibly kink up your neck if you land funny on that block with your face. So I don't particularly like it, but again, I've had several of my students tell me it really helped them get over that fear of falling forward. So if it helps you, practice it with the block like that, but then be sure to take that block away. You don't want to turn it into a crutch of having to have it there every single time you do crow. Use it until you get over that fear, until you feel a little bit more confidence, and then put it to the side. Another tip I like to use for people who are new to crow is don't think so much about lifting your toes off the ground. Think more about using your core strength to lift your tailbone up to the sky. So instead of being so focused, because what I'll see people do is they'll just jump off of their toes onto their hands, and that's a really great way to do a somersault because you've got a lot of forward momentum if you're trying to jump your way into it. So instead of thinking about jumping or lifting the toes, so much focus on that, use instead your core muscles to think about sending your tailbone up to the sky, and then your toes are just gonna naturally follow their way up. So a little less focus on having to jump the toes up. Also, another common thing I'll just address real quick with those of us who are new to crow, bruises on the triceps. It does happen sometimes. I'll see people come into class and they'll have bruises and they'll be like, oh, you've been practicing your crow, huh? That's not a permanent thing. Once you start to build up enough core strength, you get a little bit more comfortable with the placement of your knees on your triceps, you're not gonna have bruises on your arms forever, I promise. So those are a few of my favorite tips on how to get flying in your crow. There are a little bit more advanced options for crow. We can address those another time. But right now, just focus on getting those toes up, looking ahead, and try to avoid somersaults.